Hi, my name is Matthew Weis, and this is my final presentation for AREC 405. The company I chose to do is a made-up one called Mile High Logistics. It's an over-the-road trucking company based out of Denver. They've got 10 trucks in their fleet, and their aim is to maximize the use of all of their fleet trucks by minimizing the miles driven per truck per year. To continue the story, their annual profit objective is $500,000. They have 3 potential routes with 5 destinations or plants along each. And then a return route to Denver available after each stop along that route. They pay labor by the mile, and they get paid by each plant on a mileage basis also. Relevant numbers, $2.90 a gallon for diesel fuel, average 40 cents per mile paid to the driver, $2 paid per mile to the company for a fully loaded truck, 50 cents paid for a return route full of pallets. The company operates 5 days a week on 8-hour shifts. And each individual plant has a capacity of 1 truckload daily, so a maximum of 250 trucks per year. This is a brief sample of the model. It shows just probably, 10% to give a little bit of context for the next couple of slides. Top 4 constraints indicate the available trucks, the operating capital, the labor in miles, and the hours required per route or section. The remainder shows the constraints set to confine the number of trucks driven along each route to those that are available. So it essentially is just saying that you can't return from somewhere that you haven't driven to. Breakdown of the logic. The objective, as mentioned, is to minimize the sum of all mileage generating activities. So that's routes and returns. Decision variables for the model are routes and returns. Routes consume inventory, returns added back. Both consume operating capital, labor, and time. There's the opportunity to hire labor at 40 cents per mile, and the routes consume plant capacity as well, but returns obviously do not. Continuation of the logic. The constraints are such that the inventory is 10 trucks total, but they get recycled by return routes taken. Operating capital required to operate, the labor mileage requirement of labor, so you have to pay as much labor as you're supposedly driving. There's a theoretical max hours threshold set so that you don't overwork your drivers. The plant capacity as mentioned, and the patched logic, which is briefly kind of what I said before, uses continuable and return constraints that have to sum greater than 0 to make sure that each route has a truck in the previous section. The parameter values, mileage for each route was sourced from Truck Router. It's a website I found. You can kind of plug in your route and it gives you a breakdown of the trip length per destination, so it's pretty handy. Pay per mile was chosen based off of research I conducted, suggesting what was acceptable in the industry. It varies quite a lot, so I just kind of picked within those parameters. This is the full model. I'm not going to go into depth, just to kind of give you a full picture of what it looks like and how it operates. The results. I'm going to give a little bit of context first. In my breakdown in the written report, I broke the original design into a couple of counting alterations that change how operating capital is used. The first variation is that you pay for your labor with money generated, and so it doesn't require operating capital, and the second adds on return routes to that as well. So the original design and those 2 alterations require just over 1 million miles. The pay per mile variation, which is a variation where I just upped the price paid per mile to the driver or to the company, requires only 378,000. Labor hours required just under 17,000 for the original, just over 6,000 for the pay per mile alteration. The original design requires 250 routes to Minneapolis and then back to Denver, leaving 10 behind, and 224 routes to Dallas and back to Denver, stopping at every destination to meet the profit threshold. The pay per mile variation only requires 163 to Minneapolis. Sensitivity reports on operating capital are relevant because one of the things, as mentioned, that I changed significantly was how operating capital was calculated and accounted for, mostly because it was the most constraining. In the original, you almost need twice as much operating capital to generate $1 of profit, so kind of inefficient, but still functional. The labor variation, almost a 1-to-1 ratio, labor and returns variation. Now you're really leveraging your operating capital pay per mile variation with the original accounting is very similar to the best accounting strategy for on the original basis. And so we can expect that it would even get better if you altered the accounting strategies. The sensitivity for the reduced cost tables, they're in terms of miles, not dollars. So the higher numbers are further distances. This shows us that by changing the prices, the reduced costs for the return routes are lowered drastically. So we can see that in a few instances, having better route planning could actually change the strategy. You might actually want to return from Cheyenne or from some of these other routes to Denver if you only save 20 miles, 10 miles along the route, which could possibly be possible. The zero reduced cost here would suggest that there's plenty of routes that could be used by the model that aren't being used. And so I think that the reason for that is that there's a barrier to entry posed by the connected nature of the routes. So even if, so like obviously it is using these, but it's not using these. So maybe it's not using these because there's that barrier to entry. If it uses this, it can't use this, or it has to continue along this route, etc. So it can't just pick and choose. Some limitations of the model, its design prevents the problem not being able to maximize profits and keep costs low above a certain threshold. So ideally, maybe you'd have, we want to make $500,000, but above that while minimizing our miles driven would be great. You can't really reflect that very easily. Gas prices in the real world aren't static. Could be cheaper to drive to the East Coast than the West Coast just because of gas mileage or gas prices. Load prices also shift, so the static $2 isn't hyper reflective of an annual company. The routes can't be linked as much as they could be in the real world. So, there's a route in this model that goes through Nevada into California and one that goes through New Mexico into California. You, in the real world, might want to drive from Nevada to your New Mexico route to California. You can't do that. You could, in this model, set that up, but it would be a lot bigger. Some conclusions. The model is realistically accurate given its size and limitations, but it kind of tells you the obvious. The best route to take is to minimize mileage and meet profit objectives is the most efficient combination of routes. So the one that consumes the fewest resources. A larger model with better inter-route connectivity and more potential destinations would likely alter this drastically. It's likely not sufficient to use in a real world scenario beyond initial planning. Thank you. This was a lot of fun to set up and build. I was kind of surprised actually that the results only had a few routes that went all the way through, as opposed to like just kind of going a short distance and returning and using more of the routes, but I was wrong. I'd be interested in seeing how things would be altered by setting a minimum contract delivery with each plant. So, right now it's a cap of 250. What if you had to deliver 75? We did something like that in one of our labs. That could be interesting. I appreciate it. Thanks.